Hey everyone, this is a piece titled The Communist Leader's Role in the Kronstadt Tragedy of 1921 in the light of recently published archival documents by Israel Getzler. This piece is from 2002, it looks like. Yeah, it's from the journal Revolutionary Russia, volume 15, number 1, June 2002. So here we go. The little description of it, I guess the abstract says, archival documents published after the 1994 rehabilitation of the Kronstadt sailors make clear the responsibility of the communist leaders for the Kronstadt tragedy. The senior Chekist, Ikagov Agranov, in a report whose findings flatly contradict the official line, insisted that the sailors' protest was, quote, entirely spontaneous, not, quote, preceded by the, quote, activity of any counter-revolutionary organization, end quote, and not, quote, the work of agents of the Entente. Wikipedia says Yakov Agranov lived from 1893 to 1938 and was the first chief of the Soviet Main Directorate of State Security and a deputy of NKVD chief Genrik Yagoda. Yakov Agranov is known as one of the main organizers of Soviet political repressions and Stalinist show trials in the 1920s and 1930s. Yakov Agranov fabricated the Tagintsev conspiracy case and the Moscow trials, including the trial of the 21 and the Industrial Party trial, as well as mass arrests and executions in St. Petersburg during Joseph Stalin's Great Purge. Back to the text. Vasily Sivai Vasily Savai's report shows that already a month before the Kronstadters' protest, the communist leadership was made aware of the sailors' thorough alienation. When the uprising started, Savai urged Trotsky to establish an extraordinary troika for the sailors' quote, filtration and quote, selection, which eventually led to the execution of thousands of Kronstadt sailors. So here we go. Although 80 years have passed since the Kronstadt uprising, it is only now, thanks to the massive documentation published in the wake of President Eltsin's ukaz, which is like a decree, of the 10th of January 1994. Second, I gotta get the footnotes. There's nothing here. Anyway, continuing on. Thanks to the massive documentation published in the President Yeltsin's ukaz of the 10th of January 1994, that it has become possible at last to piece together a reasonably credible account of the communist leaders' role in that tragedy. As for their victims, the published documentation adds very little to what was known. Eltsin's momentous decree ordered the, quote, rehabilitation of the sailors, soldiers, and workers of Kronstadt repressed on charges of armed mutiny, end quote. Further ordering the, quote, setting up in Kronstadt of a monument in memory of the victims of the Kronstadt events of the spring of 1921, end quote. Pride of place among these documents, many of them marked, quote, secret, quote, strictly secret, quote, highly secret, quote, top secret, and a few even, quote, most urgent top secret, goes, in my opinion, that Yakov Agronov's 5th of April 1921 report titled On the Results of the Investigation into the Mutiny in the Town of Kronstadt. Footnote. I wish to thank the editors of the 2 volumes of the Kronstadtskaya Tragedia for their large collection of invaluable archival documents and for the copious, well-researched annotations. While this rich collection contains many documents that could not have been known to Agronov at the time when Agronov conducted his investigation, I have not found any that might weaken Agronov's analysis. End footnote. Agronov, a highly intelligent and experienced, quote, special plenipotentiary of the secret operational department of the Vycheka, end quote, parenthesis, later to become its formidable head, end parenthesis, was sent by the presidium of that body, parenthesis, Felix Dzerzhinsky and Vyacheslav Menjinsky, end parenthesis, to Kronstadt soon after the crushing of the uprising, quote, to ascertain the role of various parties and groups in the start and development of the uprising, and the ties of its organizers and inspirers with counter-revolutionary parties and organizations operating both in and outside Soviet Russia, end quote. Following that mandate, and certainly no later than the 24th of March, Agronov is on record as having begun a series of investigations of those Kronstadt activists who had not made their escape to Finland, as well as some local communist and Vycheka functionaries. Agronov also immersed himself in the Vycheka materials and the 15 numbers of the Izvestia of the Provisional Revolutionary Committee, bracket Revcom, end bracket, of Kronstadt. In Agronov's considered opinion, the, quote, uprising was entirely spontaneous in origin and drew into its maelstrom almost the entire population and the garrison of the fortress. With the formation of the Revolutionary Committee, and generally, thanks to the concentration of military operations in the hands of the staff of the fortress, the uprising came to assume a planned character under the command of the old officers' corps. But the investigation failed to show that the outbreak of the mutiny was preceded by the activity of any counter-revolutionary organization at work among the fortress's command, or that it was the work of agents of the Entente. The entire course of the movement speaks against that possibility. Had the mutiny been the work of some secret organization which predated its outbreak, then that organization would not have planned it for a time when the reserves of fuel and provisions were hardly sufficient for 2 weeks, and when the thawing of the ice was still far off. End quote. Agronov. Agronov also drew attention to the fact that the official Soviet propaganda, notably the appeals of the Council of Labor and Defense, signed by Lenin and Trotsky on the 2nd of March, and of the Defense Committee of Petrograd, 3rd of March, which pinned responsibility for the uprising on, quote, the agents of the Entente and on General Alexander Kozlovsky, had only served to anger Kronstadt sailors and workers, end quote. Agronov. Quote, the masses were fully aware of the spontaneity of their movement and were so convinced of their strength and so much enthralled to a belligerent enthusiasm that they did not even for a moment consider the possibility that there were white guardist spies in their midst, bracket, so much so that, end bracket, almost all the appeals of the Soviet government were published in full in the pages of the Kronstadt newspaper. End quote. Agronov. The early confidence, Agronov found, was common to both, quote, the Revcom and the masses which had given birth to that body, end quote. Agronov. Convinced, as they were of the inaccessibility of Kronstadt, and of, quote, the reluctance of the worker-peasant government to risk casualties, and unwillingness which would compel it to make concessions, they believed, end quote. Agranov. What strikes one as remarkable and puzzling in Agranov's impressive analysis of the origins of the Kronstadt events is that it diverges fundamentally from the official Soviet line, which right from the start had denounced the Kronstadt protest movement as a white gardes entente plot and focused it on to an absurd degree on the insignificant General Alexander Kozlovsky and his officers. Agranov's conclusions are not his alone, but are supported by a variety of independent and reliable testimonies. Alexei Nikolaev, chairman of the Extraordinary Troika of the First and Second Special Section, reported on the 20th of April on the results of his double assignment, quote, the punishment of the mutineers and the unmasking of all the organizations that prepared and led the mutiny, end quote. Conceded that, quote, in spite of all efforts, we have been unable to discover the presence of any organization and to seize any agents, end quote. Footnote, A.P. Nikolaev's report of the 20th of April to the chairman of the Petrograd Gubcheka, Nikolai Komarov, on the results of the, quote, reprisals against the Kronstadt mutineers, end quote. End footnote. Similarly, during the investigation of 19 and 25th of March 1921, the veteran Kronstadt leader Nikolai Lamanov, chairman of the Kronstadt Soviet from 1917 to 1918, and one of the editors of the Revkom's Izvestia in March 1921, told Nikolai Lamanov's investigators, Alexander Isolevich and Agranov, that, quote, for me, the mutiny was unexpected, ... It seemed to me quite spontaneous. I had heard nothing of its preparation, end quote. Footnote, Protocols of Investigation of A.N. Lamanov, 19th and 25th of March, 1921. Likewise, end footnote, likewise, Ivan Oreshin, the sole intelligent on the Revcom, parenthesis, he was the director of the trade school and head of the People's University, end parenthesis, and something like its foreign minister, wrote in his, parenthesis, unpublished, end parenthesis, memoirs, that, quote, the Kronstadt movement was spontaneous, end quote. Footnote, manuscript of the former member of the Kronstadt Revcom, I.E. Oreshin, published in some Russian book. End footnote. Again, Vladislav Volk, parenthesis, a Menshevik activist in 1917 to 18 and a member of the Revcom in March 1921, end parenthesis, stated under investigation on the 17th of March 1921 that, quote, until the 1st of March, I had heard nothing of any preparations for the Kronstadt events, end quote. Vladislav Volk. Finally, Ivan Brushvit, parenthesis, a prominent SR leader and head of the SR Administrative Center in Finland, end parenthesis, wrote in a letter which he sent from Helsinki as early as the 18th of March, reporting the fall of Kronstadt, quote, one usually looks for those responsible, bracket, for the failure, end bracket. It is difficult to find them in this case, as it is generally difficult to analyze the causes and results of events that are so absolutely spontaneous. The movement began spontaneously without any organization and quite unexpectedly. After all, a month later, Kronstadt would have been inaccessible to the Bolsheviks and 100 times more dangerous to them. End quote. Ivan Brushvit. With the question of the spontaneity of the revolt, which has bedeviled the historiography of the Kronstadt movement for 6 decades, now settled, at least to my satisfaction, I now want to use the recently available archival materials to re-examine how the communist leaders responded to the protest movement of the sailors, soldiers, and workers of Kronstadt, explained by Trotsky during the July days of 1917, and by the Bolsheviks ever since, at least until 1921, as the pride and glory of the Russian Revolution. One can divide into two the documentation covering the first few days, i.e. from the evening of the 28th of February, when the famous Petropavlovsk resolution was drafted and adopted aboard the battleship of that name, to the 2nd of March, when the first government statement was published. In the first group of documents, we also include the statements and protocols of the cross-examination of local communist leaders made after the fall of Kronstadt. The second group consists of secret communications between Zinoviev, Trotsky, and Lenin, and references to phone calls between them during the Kronstadt uprising. Our story begins on the 28th of February when Nikolai Kuzmin, who had been appointed to succeed Fyodor Raskolnikov as the Commissar of the Baltic Fleet on the 24th of February, was still in Petrograd, claiming later that he was needed there to, quote, calm down the naval units, having received, quote, alarming news from Kronstadt. Nikolai Kuzmin hurried to the island on the evening of the 28th of February, thinking, parenthesis, as Nikolai Kuzmin explained on the 25th of March in the Petrograd Soviet, end parenthesis, that, quote, just as in Petrograd, we succeeded tactfully and in a friendly way by various means, bracket, stick and carrot, end bracket, in calming down the workers, ... We have the example of Petrograd before us, for there, too, there had been a terrible situation which we were able to calm, and thus we hoped that the same would happen in Kronstadt, end quote. Nikolai Kuzmin. Parenthesis, and Kuzmin was to stick firmly to this version of events even when he was investigated on the 9th of June by Pyotr Karas, plenipotentiary of the special section of the Cheka, to whom he confessed, quote, I generally hope to settle things peacefully, bracket, in Kronstadt, end bracket, following the example of Petrograd, end quote, end parenthesis. Footnote, Session of Petrograd Soviet of 25th of March. Protocol of investigation of former Commissar of Baltic Fleet, Kuzmin. End footnote. On the morning of the 10th of March, Kuzmin, together with Pavel Vasiliev, chairman of the Kronstadt Soviet, and Mikhail Kalinin, chairman of the Central Executive Committee of Soviets, parenthesis, CEC, end parenthesis, confronted an angry crowd of some 16,000 assembled in Anchor Square, shouting their fierce condemnation of the communist regime. When at last Kalinin and Kuzmin were able to make themselves heard, Kalinin and Kuzmin enraged the crowd even further by insisting that, quote, Kronstadt does not represent the whole of Russia, and therefore we shall take no account of Kronstadt, exclamation point, end quote. Small wonder that the mass meeting, which was attended by many Communist Party members, almost unanimously adopted the Petropavlovsk Resolution, which maintained in its first and central point that since, quote, the present Soviets do not express the will of the workers and peasants, new elections be held immediately by secret ballot, preceded by free agitation for all workers and peasants, end quote. The Petropavlovsk Resolution, which is on this channel, by the way. Its second point demanded, quote, freedom of speech and of the press for workers and peasants, anarchist and left socialist parties, end quote. Petropavlovsk Resolution. While point 3 demanded, quote, freedom of assembly for trade unions and peasant associations, end quote. Petropavlovsk Resolution. Only Kuzmin, Vasilyev, Kalinin, and a few party functionaries voted against. The meeting also decided to convene a conference of 2 delegates, each from every ship's crew, army unit, dock, workshop, trade union, and Soviet institution, to meet next day and work out procedures for new elections to the Kronstadt Soviet. Footnote: Stepan Petrichenko and something and E.I. Orishin. From some book published in Russian. The Kronstadtskaya Tragedia, Volume 2. After the fiasco of their appearance at the mass meeting in Anchor Square, Kuzmin, Kalinin, and Vasilyev met in the evening and conferred with the Kronstadt Party Committee. Taking stock of the situation, Kuzmin, Kalinin, and Vasilyev decided that Kuzmin, Kalinin, and Vasilyev had no reliable troops for repressive action, which in any case only, quote, enraged the masses and win no sympathy among party members, end quote. After consulting, quote, Petrograd, end quote, bracket, Zinoviev, question mark, and bracket, by phone, Kuzmin, Kalinin, and Vasilyev decided that the next day, Vasilyev should go to the delegates' conference charged with, quote, drawing out the session so as to gain time and direct the entire movement towards the principles of the Soviet Constitution, end quote. When the conference opened at 2 p.m., Stepan Petrichenko, who chaired the meeting, read out the Petropavlovsk Resolution and proposed that the meeting appoint a commission to prepare elections to the Soviet. It was then that Kuzmin, who had accompanied Vasilyev to the meeting, asked for permission to speak. That the meeting, he said, must choose between either an insistence on, quote, the garrison, bracket, i.e. Petropavlovsk, and bracket, resolution, end quote, which would put them, quote, on the road to uprising, end quote, or, quote, petitioning the central organ of Soviet power, end quote. Stepan Petrichenko was supported by Vasilyev. So wait, who's it? No, that wasn't who said that quote. Sorry, I fucked that up. It was then that Kuzmin, who had accompanied Vasilyev to the meeting, asked for permission to speak. The meeting, Kuzmin said, must choose between either an insistence on, quote, the garrison, bracket, i.e. Petropavlovsk, and bracket, resolution, end quote, which would put them on, quote, the road to uprising, end quote, or, quote, petitioning the central organ of Soviet power, end quote. Kuzmin. Nikolai Kuzmin was supported by Vasilyev, who pointed out that, quote, the chairman of the executive committee of the Soviet, end quote, bracket, Vasilyev himself, end bracket, had already fixed new elections to the Soviet for the 5th of March, the day its mandate was due to expire, and that the meeting therefore had no choice but to go ahead with the elections on the basis of the Soviet Constitution. All other points of the resolution could be realized, as Kuzmin had indicated, by petitioning the CEC. Footnote: for the full text in English of the Petropavlovsk resolution, and for analyses thereof, see Paul Avrich, Kronstadt 1921, published in 1970, and Israel Getzler, Kronstadt 1917 to 1921, The Fate of a Soviet Democracy, published in 1983. Testimonies of P.D. Vasiliev, A.G. Zosimov, and E.K. Kurshunov on the Kronstadt events, 24th to the 2nd of March. Kronstadtskaya Tragedia, Volume 1. End footnote. The remarks so angered the meeting that Petrochenko and the Presidium successfully moved that Kuzmin and Vasiliev be arrested, and they were removed for imprisonment in the Petropavlovsk. Footnote: Kuzmin, Session of Petrograd Soviet, 25th of March. Published in the Kronstadtskaya Tragedia. End footnote. Fearing that a detachment of the special section of the Cheka was about to take repressive action, the conference decided to elect a 5-member Provisional Revolutionary Committee, the Revcom, with Stepan Petrochenko as chairman, that would base itself on the Petropavlovsk resolution. Footnote: see Investigation of V.A. Volk, 17th of March. Also Investigation of Kuzmin, 9th of June. With Kuzmin and Vasiliev under arrest, attention must now turn to the role of the Soviet leaders Zinoviev, Trotsky, and Lenin in these events. Zinoviev set the tone when, from the Smolny, during the evening of the 28th of February, Zinoviev cabled Lenin in the Kremlin, quote, Kronstadt's 2 largest battleships, the Sevastopol and the Petropavlovsk, have adopted SR Black 100 resolutions presenting an ultimatum of 24 hours, end quote. Zinoviev to Lenin, 28th of February. A day later at 10:15 p.m. in a cable marked, quote, top secret, Zinoviev informed Lenin, with a copy to Trotsky, quote, everything is still unclear in Kronstadt and extremely alarming. In case of an uprising, the Petrograd sailors cannot be relied upon. Our reliable forces are, bracket R, 3,000 Kursanti, Army cadets, and 2,000 Communars, Communist Party members, The Military Council, of Petrograd, requests that 4 squadrons of Moscow and Tver Kursanti be moved here immediately, and that Kursanti infantry be held on alert, end quote. Zinoviev to Lenin and Trotsky, 1st of March. That same day, Trotsky, in a cable marked, quote, top secret, informed E.I. Batis, the head of the Pulbot, political section of the Baltic Fleet, quote, there are repeated reports in the foreign press on conspiracies and uprisings in Kronstadt and in the Baltic Fleet. Our entire past experience tells us that such rumors precede real events, since the centers of conspiracies are situated abroad, and in the foreign press such information about conspiracies that are being prepared emanates from white Guardist emigre circles. Thus, it happened, for example, in Nizhny Novgorod, and many times before, It is essential to discuss this problem with all competent bodies and to take all necessary preventative measures, end quote. Trotsky to E.I. Battis, 1st of March, 1921. Finally, on the 2nd of March, 1921, that is, most likely after the arrest of Kuzmin and Vasiliev, Zinoviev, Kalinin, and Mikhail Lashevich, member of the Defense Council, cabled Trotsky, quote, "We are now convinced that the events in Kronstadt are the beginning of an uprising. We presume that tomorrow morning events will develop quickly. We need your help," end quote. Zinoviev, Kalinin, and Mikhail Lashevich. In the draft of this cable, Zinoviev, Kalinin, and Mikhail Lashevich spelled out their requirements, quote, "Send immediately by armored trains absolutely reliable units, in particular cavalry. Immediately move here all reliable sailor communists living in Moscow," end quote. Zinoviev, Kalinin, and M.M. Lashevich to Trotsky, 2nd of March, 1921. The turning point in the confrontation between the Kronstadt protest movement on the one hand and the Soviet leaders on the other came on the 2nd of March with the first official government announcement, probably drafted by Zinoviev, duly signed, and checked, by V. Ulyanov, or Lenin, as chairman of the Council of Labor and Defense, and Trotsky as chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council of the Army and Navy of the Republic, RVSR, end parenthesis. Footnote, government statement of the 2nd of March. That announcement echoed some elements in the exchanges between the Soviet leaders. Quoting the Parisian newspaper Utro, Lenin apparently inserted the French name Matin, of the 13th of February 1921, that alleged that an uprising of sailors against Soviet state power had taken place in Kronstadt, note Trotsky's cable to Battis, note Trotsky's cable to Battis, It pointed to French counterintelligence, which, quote, undoubtedly, end quote, had prepared the event in Kronstadt and also singled out, quote, the adoption of a Black Hundreds SR resolution at a general meeting, end quote, thus turning around and sharpening Zinoviev's cable, end parenthesis. The new and ominous element of the government's announcement was the report that, quote, during the morning of the 2nd of March, former General Kozlovsky and 3 of his officers appeared openly on the scene in the role of mutineers. Under their leadership, the original draft had the more restrained, quote, under the influence, end quote, end bracket. Kuzmin, Vasiliev, and other officials were arrested, and thus the significance of the latest events has become crystal clear. Behind the SRs, in this instance too, there stood a czarish general. End quote. Quote, in view of all this, the Council of Labor and Defense decrees that the former General Kozlovsky and his supporters be proclaimed outlaws. The town of Petrograd and Petrograd province are hereby proclaimed as being in a state of siege, end quote. Political ideological isolation was followed by the physical isolation of Kronstadt from the mainland. Military units reinforced by battalions of Kursanti occupied Oranienbaum, Peterhof, Sestroretsk, and Lysinos. Quote, communication between Kronstadt and Petrograd has been put under the control of the military council, end quote. Zinoviev informed Trotsky. Footnote. Measures to blockade Kronstadt in the Kronstadtskaya Tragedia. In footnote. That government announcement was supported the next day, the 3rd of March, by an article in the Izvestia Petrogradskogo Soveta, which denounced, quote, the Tsarist General Kozlovsky, end quote, as a, quote, supporter of Yudenich and Kolchak, end quote. Footnote. It was published in 3rd of March 1921. In this connection, the career of Kozlovsky is of some interest. In the wake of the February Revolution, the Kronstadt Soviet elected Kozlovsky chief of staff of the Kronstadt fortress, and soon after the October Revolution, Kozlovsky was one of the first generals who entered the service of the Bolsheviks, serving the Bolsheviks so loyally that on the 3rd of December 1919, Kozlovsky was awarded a watch by the Petrograd Soviet, quote, for military feats and energetic activities during the attack of the Yudenich bands on Petrograd, end quote. This award was officially confirmed by F. Raskolnikov, Commissar of the Baltic Fleet, on the 20th of October, 1920. So what's that, 6 months before Kronstadt? End footnote. The Revolutionary Committee's answer to the government announcement came immediately on the 2nd of March in the form of a rather restrained appeal, quote, to the population of the fortress and the town of Kronstadt, end quote, offering, quote, to lead the Republic out of the present blindality by a common effort and the collective will of the working masses, end quote. The appeal insisted at the same time that, quote, the garrison meeting on the 1st of March unanimously adopted a resolution which included a decision to hold immediate elections to the Soviet, on a more equitable basis so the working masses would be genuinely represented there, end quote. Also included in the appeal is a report on the conference of delegates of sailors, soldiers, and workers' organizations to work out new election procedures. But it was noted, quote, since there were reasons to fear repression, and in light of the threatening speeches of the representatives of the authorities, bracket, Kuzmin and Vasiliev, end bracket, the conference had decided to form a provisional revolutionary committee and to empower it to administer the town and the fortress, end quote. A spate of fierce official statements was issued in the next few days. On the 3rd of March, an appeal of the Petrograd Soviet fully endorsed the denunciation by the government of the, quote, White Guardist conspiracy of the former General Kozlovsky and of the battleship Petropavlovsk, end quote, and warned the workers of Petrograd, quote, against the sharp knife directed against their backs from Kronstadt, end quote. It also accused the Mensheviks and SRs of having, quote, paved the way for the mutinous White Guardist general, a new trump card in the hands of the Entente, end quote. Footnote. Appeal to the Petrograd Soviet. To the sailors of the Baltic Fleet, published 3rd of March, 1921. That was followed by a direct, quote, appeal to the workers, sailors, and soldiers of Kronstadt, end quote, adopted by an enlarged session of the Petrograd Soviet on the 4th of March. It told the Kronstadters, quote, you must immediately arrest the ringleaders of the counter-revolutionary conspiracy, exclamation point. You should immediately restore the Kronstadt Soviet. This is our last warning, Decide immediately. You are either with us against the common enemy, or you will perish shamefully and ignominiously together with the counter-revolutionaries." End quote. Footnote: Session of Petrograd Soviet, 4th of March. In the same vein and on the same day came an appeal of the Petrograd Defense Committee addressed to, quote, "the deceived Kronstadters." Quote, "Should you stubbornly persist, you will be shot down like partridges. ... Disarm and arrest the criminal ringleaders, in particular the Tsar's generals. He who surrenders immediately will be pardoned." End quote. Footnote: Appeal to the Committee of Defense of Petrograd, to the workers, the sailors, and Red Army soldiers, 4th of March, 1921. In none of these appeals was there so much as a mention of the offer by the Izvestia of the Revolutionary Committee to cooperate in taking the Republic out of the blind alley into which it had strayed. By the 5th of March, if not earlier, the Soviet leaders had decided to crush Kronstadt. Thus, in a cable to E.S. Sklyansky, member of the Council of Labor and Defense, on that day, Trotsky insisted that, quote, "only the seizure of Kronstadt will put an end to the political crisis in Petrograd." End quote. Trotsky to E.M. Sklyansky, 5th of March, 1921. End footnote. On the same day, acting as a chairman of the RVSR, Trotsky ordered the reformation and mobilization of the 7th Army, quote, "to suppress the uprising in Kronstadt," end quote, and appointed General Mikhail Tukhachevsky as its commander in charge with suppressing the rising in Kronstadt. Wikipedia says Mikhail Tukhachevsky lived from 1893 to 1937 and was nicknamed the Red Napoleon. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was a Soviet general who was prominent between 1918 and 1937 as a military officer and theoretician. Mikhail Tukhachevsky was later executed during the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938. Mikhail Tukhachevsky served as an officer in World War I of 1914 to 1917 and in the Russian Civil War 1917 to 1923, leading the defense of the Moscow District 1918, commanding forces on the Eastern Front 1918, commanding the 5th Army in the recapture of Siberia from Alexander Kolchak, and heading Cossack forces against Anton Denikin in 1920. From 1920 to 1921, he commanded the Soviet Western Front in the Polish-Soviet War. Soviet forces under Tukhachevsky's command successfully repelled the Polish forces from western Ukraine, driving them back into Poland. But the Red Army suffered defeat outside of Warsaw, and the war ended in a Soviet defeat. Mikhail Tukhachevsky blamed Joseph Stalin for Mikhail Tukhachevsky's defeat at the Battle of Warsaw. Mikhail Tukhachevsky later served as Chief of Staff of the Red Army from 1925 to 1928 as assistant in the People's Commissariat of Defense, after 1934 and as commander of the Volga Military District in 1937. Mikhail Tukhachevsky achieved the rank of Marshal of the Soviet Union in 1935. As a major proponent of modernization of Soviet armament and army force structure in the 1920s and 1930s, he became instrumental in the development of Soviet aviation and of mechanized and airborne forces. As a theoretician, Mikhail Tukhachevsky was a driving force behind the Soviet development of the theory of deep operations. In the 1920s and 1930s, Soviet authorities accused Tukhachevsky of treason, and after Tukhachevsky confessed during torture, Mikhail Tukhachevsky was executed in 1937 during the military purges of 1936 to 1938, led by Stalin and Nikolai Yezhov. Back to the text. On the same day, which is March 5th, acting as chairman of the RVSR, Trotsky ordered the formation and mobilization of the 7th Army, quote, to suppress the uprising in Kronstadt, unquote, and appointed General Mikhail Tukhachevsky as the 7th Army's commander, charged with suppressing the uprising in Kronstadt in the shortest possible time, end quote. Footnote. Order of RVSR to reform 7th Army, 5th of March. End footnote. Trotsky and Tukhachevsky issued an appeal, quote, to the garrison and the population of Kronstadt and the mutinous force, end quote, which ordered, quote, all those who have taken up arms against the socialist fatherland to lay down their arms. Those who resist will be disarmed and handed over to the Soviet authorities. Only those who surrender unconditionally may count on the mercy of the Soviet Republic, end quote. With the communist authorities confident that, quote, the rebellion of the sailors of the Baltic Fleet will be suppressed in the next few days, end quote, and the offensive planned for the 8th of March and the 7th of March, Trotsky was already considering what to do with the defeated, mutinous, and thoroughly alienated sailors. Footnote. Appeal of RVSR to the garrison and population of Kronstadt and to the mutinous forts. 5th of March. End footnote. Trotsky had before him a report of Vasily Sevy, plenipotentiary of the special section of the Cheka, which proposed, quote, the creation of an extraordinary troika for the filtration of the mutineers and the investigation of their connections, end quote. Footnote. Reports of VN Sevy to Trotsky, 7th of March. End footnote. The report began with the proposition that, quote, the Baltic Fleet has all but ceased to exist, ... A large majority of the Baltic Fleet's sailors have grouped together and united by naval patriotism. They have constituted themselves as a caste and have totally separated from the proletariat. Under the influence of inaction, they have degenerated into a parasitical element. In place of proletarian ideology, they have substituted their unshakable conviction that they are the pride, glory, and vanguard of the revolution, ... These sailors were and still are professional revolutionaries and could well form the basis of a possible third revolution. The disease from which they suffer has been too long neglected and must now be cured by surgical methods, as there is no time left for organic remedies. The most effective method is the setting up of a completely independent, extraordinary troika, which would act on your (Trotsky's) and directives and be directly responsible to the special section of the Cheka. ... The work of the troika will be regarded as at an end only when all undesirable elements have been completely filtered and when the mutineers' ties with right-wing political parties have been fully exposed and the involvement of Estonia and Finland has been fully established. The Troika must also have the power to punish, including the imposition of the supreme penalty. End quote. What is remarkable about this startling social political profile of the, quote, large majority of the sailors of the Baltic Fleet, end quote, is that it was not written in response to the Kronstadt crisis, but that Savai, what the hell is his name again? Savai must have formulated it well before. As Savai put it in his report to Trotsky, quote, I stated these views more than a month ago, bracket, that is sometime late in January or early in February, end bracket, in my memorandum to Comrade, bracket, Nikolai, and bracket, Krestinsky, bracket, then Secretary of the Communist Party, end bracket, end quote. Wikipedia says Nikolai Krestinsky lived from 1883 to 1938 and was a Soviet Bolshevik revolutionary and politician who serves as the responsible secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Born in Mogilev to a Ukrainian family, Nikolai Krestinsky studied law at St. Petersburg Imperial University, where Nikolai Krestinsky embraced revolutionary politics. Nikolai Krestinsky became a member of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party in 1903, and 2 years later, Nikolai Krestinsky supported Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction following the RSDLP split. Repeatedly arrested, Nikolai Krestinsky was exiled to the Urals in 1914, shortly before the outbreak of the First World War. After the 1917 February Revolution brought an end to the monarchy, Nikolai Krestinsky led the Bolsheviks in Yekaterinburg before returning to Petrograd. Nikolai Krestinsky was named People's Commissar for Finance and elected to the first Politburo. After the death of Yakov Sverdlov, Krestinsky also served as responsible secretary of the Russian Communist Party. Nikolai Krestinsky was an ally of Leon Trotsky and supported the left opposition. With the rise of Joseph Stalin, Nikolai Krestinsky gradually fell from power and lost his positions in the government, save for Krestinsky's post as Soviet ambassador to Germany. Nikolai Krestinsky eventually repudiated Nikolai Krestinsky's opposition and capitulated to Stalin. Nikolai Krestinsky was arrested in 1937 in the Great Purge and charged with treason. Nikolai Krestinsky was found guilty in the 1938 trial of the 21 and executed. Back to the text. Trotsky, in a cable marked, quote, most urgent, top secret, immediately pressed on Savai's report to Menjinsky, head of the secret section of the Cheka. Trotsky noted that while Savai advocated a troika, there was also an alternative proposal to set up a five-man body, bracket Piaterka, Piaterka, end bracket, which would include Nikolai Komarov, parenthesis, chairman of the Petrograd Cheka, and Zinoviev's protege, end parenthesis, who would perhaps be the chairman, and other men from Petrograd, plus the original Troika members, the Chekist Savai, Iosilovich, and Dezhnitsky. He, parenthesis, Trotsky, end parenthesis, personally preferred the original Troika, but wanted Menjinsky to let him know urgently which he preferred. The next day, on the 8th of March, Trotsky, in an attempt to block the appointment of Komarov, sent Menjinsky Savai's report on Komarov with a similar request for an immediate decision. Quote, I report, bracket, Donashu, end bracket, that according to absolutely trustworthy information in my possession, the chairman of the Petrograd Cheka, Comrade Komarov, regards the Kronstadt events as a spontaneous movement and is in full solidarity with the bracket Menshevik Fyodor in bracket Dan as to its causes. In this situation, Moscow's insistence on Komarov's participation and even chairmanship of the Pieterka will guarantee that the Pieterka will be stillborn and will reduce all our initiatives to nothing. End quote. Trotsky. Footnote, Trotsky to Menjinsky, 8th of March, 1921. And footnote, to emphasize this point, Savy asked Trotsky to raise the question of completely isolating the Pieterka from all, quote, local influences, end quote. Otherwise, he, quote, would most respectfully ask for permission to refuse to serve in a Pieterka, which will achieve nothing more than a continuation of the failed policies of the Petrograd Cheka, end quote. Savy. On the 9th of March, Trotsky, in a cable to Shliansky, with a copy to Menjinsky, not only reiterated Savy's information on Komarov, but also added that the task at hand was not only to search for white Gardists and SRs, but also to remove unsuitable commissars and commanders. Trotsky served notice that, quote, I will therefore refrain from issuing an order for the setting up of a special section commission, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote, Trotsky to Skliansky, 9th of March, 1921. Apparently, Trotsky had already decided on a thorough purge of the political leadership of the Baltic Fleet, which Trotsky began to carry out immediately after the fall of Kronstadt. At the same time as Savy and Trotsky were blackening the sailors of the Baltic Fleet, Ivan Sladkov, a veteran Kronstadt Bolshevik and commissar to the Krasnoflotsky Fort, formerly Krasnaya Gorka, sent a report to Skliansky, which similarly, though in less refined language, urged the need for a drastic purge of the Baltic Fleet. In a cable marked most urgent, top secret, Ivan Skladov alluded to the failure of the attack on Kronstadt of 8th of March, writing, quote, in the Kronstadt garrison, the power of the mutineers shows great initiative, ... All exhortations and appeals have no effect, as the leftist R's have succeeded in deceiving the majority of the mass of soldiers, sailors, and workers of Kronstadt, and have entered into a close alliance with the White Guardist officers, and handed power over to the White Guardist officers. ... They planted in the more fortified places of Kronstadt packs of Mensheviks, SRs, and such like scum. ... As I see it, that den must be finished off. ... Otherwise, it may affect the external side of the Republic. I entreat you, Comrade Skliansky, to bring to light at the 10th Congress the shape of the Navy of the future. Since the Navy, as it is now, does not serve the purposes of the Republic, this Navy is dissolute, unbridled, and requires a fundamental regeneration. Without that fundamental and drastic change of the Navy, one cannot be sure that there will be no repeat of an adventure similar to that of the Kronstadt mutiny. End quote. Ivan Sladkov to Skliansky, 8th of March, 1921. And Wikipedia says Ephraim Skliansky lived from 1892 to 1925 and was a Soviet revolutionary and statesman. Ephraim Skliansky was one of the founders of the Red Army, an associate of Leon Trotsky, and a major contributor to the communist victory in the Russian Civil War. Ephraim Skliansky's death by drowning during a visit to the USA caused enduring speculation that he may have been murdered. Back to the text. Zinoviev, at the evening session of the Executive Committee of the Petrograd Soviet on the 8th of March, reporting that, quote, the first attack on Kronstadt was unsuccessful, unquote, explained why, quote, there was considerable resistance, since they all understand that no retreat is possible and that they will be cruelly put down. They therefore fight with a courage born of despair, end quote. Zinoviev cautioned, quote, perhaps as happens quite often, the Kronstadt thing, bracket, Stuka, end bracket, exploded earlier than we wanted, and that should serve us as a warning, end quote. Zinoviev at the session of Executive Committee of Petrograd Soviet, 8th of March. End footnote. If that warning was addressed to Trotsky, it was certainly lost on Trotsky. Indeed, 2 days later, on the 10th of March, in a cable to the Politburo marked, quote, top secret, Trotsky highlighted the danger of an imminent thaw of the ice which would, quote, restore Kronstadt's contacts with the outside world, but make the island inaccessible to us. We must liquidate Kronstadt in the next few days at any cost. This can only be achieved by the mobilization of a significant number of communist and party workers in fighting trim. Extraordinary measures are demanded. I fear that neither the party nor the members of the Central Committee fully realize the exceptional gravity of the Kronstadt problem. End quote. Trotsky to the Politburo, 10th of March, 1921. Though the army was ordered to be ready for the assault on the 13th of March, the attack had to be deferred 3 times because knee-deep water covered the ice and a number of army units, notably the 79th Brigade, refused to obey the, quote, battle order and move into position, saying, quote, we will fight the last man on the shore, but we will not go onto the ice, end quote. Indeed, the army was ready for the attack only as late as the night of the 16th to the 17th of March, 1921, and only after the extraordinary troika of Alexei Nikolaev had arrested over 100 so-called instigators, 74 of whom he had publicly shot. Footnote, SS Kamenev to Tukhachevsky, 15th of March, 1921. The reprisals, bracket, Rasprava, end bracket, against the mutineers began even before Kronstadt was finally subdued and the island fully occupied. Early in the morning of the 18th of March, Clement Voroshilov, parenthesis, military commissar of the 7th Army, in parenthesis, gave the order to, quote, filter most thoroughly all those arrested and sent here, keeping in mind that, foul elements will try to disguise themselves as communists or sympathizers, and to carry out this task we shall need to reinforce the special section with people who are suited to this work, end quote. Clement Voroshilov, order of K.E. Voroshilov, 18th of March, end footnote. Okay. Yeah, I heard ya. I'll be in. Where the hell am I? In this spirit, in Kronstadt itself, according to a 30th of March report of the Kronstadt Special Section, 48 informers were recruited and 3,154 arrests were made. In the night of the 29th to the 30th of March, A general search of the entire town took place, which, quote, yielded satisfactory results, end quote. Footnote, the activities of the special section of Kronstadt, 30th of March. Already during the uprising and immediately after, 4,836 Kronstadt sailors were arrested and deported to the Crimea and the Caucasus. But when Lenin learned of this on the 19th of April, he expressed, quote, great misgivings regarding the location of these sailors, end quote, bracket, in these years, end bracket. As a result, these, quote, Kronstadt sailor bandits, end quote, bracket, banditsky matrosi, end bracket, as they are referred to in the Politburo Protocols of the 27th of April 1921, were eventually, after much searching for suitable concentration camps and repeated filtration procedures worked out by Ivan Sladkov, sent into forced labor camps in Archangelsk, Vologda, and Murmansk regions. Footnote, Dzerzhinsky and G.G. Yagoda on Lenin's apprehensions, 29th of April 1921. End footnote. As for the large majority of Kronstadt sailors who had not joined the 8,000 soldiers and civilians who had made their escape over the ice to Finland, but had fought it out to the bitter end, notably the crews of the Petropavlovsk and the Sevastopol, as well as the cadets of the mechanics school, of the torpedo detachment, and of the communications unit, they all fell into the hands of the extraordinary Troika, which consisted of Nikolaev, its experienced chairman, and Alexander Gribov, parenthesis, a tough veteran Kronstadt Bolshevik, and parenthesis, and A. Timofeyev. Is that the Timofeyev of Democratic Centralist fame? I know the workers' group was the only group that actually protested what was done in Kronstadt. One second. I gotta look this up because it's bugging me. I want to know. No, it doesn't look like it's the same person, but I might be wrong. Anyway, one second. Let's see workers' opposition. I don't think I'm seeing any particular names. I don't know. I don't think I can see anything that will tell me very much. Anyway, I don't think it's the same guy. Anyway, where the hell am I?
I'm going to repeat the last sentence I read because I feel like it's been a while since I started finished it. As for the large majority of Kronstadt sailors who had not joined the 8,000 sailors and civilians who had made their escape over the ice to Finland, but had fought it out to the bitter end, notably the crews of Petropavlovsk and Sevastopol, as well as the cadets of the mechanics school, of the torpedo detachment, and of the communications unit, they all fell into the hands of the extraordinary Troika, which consisted of Nikolaev, its experienced chairman Alexander Gribov, parenthesis, a tough veteran Kronstadt Bolshevik, and A. Timofev. They certainly had not been Trotsky's choice, but they knew how to, quote, filter and employ, quote, surgical methods. Nikolaev's 20th of April report on the, quote, results of the reprisals against the mutineers in the period of the 20th of March to the 15th of April contains the following data. Of 3,000 active participants in the mutiny, 40%, parenthesis, 1,200, and parenthesis, were sentenced to death, 25% to 5 years of forced labor, and 35% were released. Nikolaev complained that in carrying out their work, the Troika had had to rely exclusively on information provided by the special section of the Vicheka. See, it's a weird thing. I keep saying, it says Vicheka, V-E Cheka. I don't know if that's like if that just means Cheka. I don't know. Maybe I've already looked this up because I'm reading this piece in segments, but yeah, it's the same thing. It's just it's the Cheka. Just like they're spelling Trotsky funny, like they do in some like academic pieces, like what the hell is it? Trotskii. Anyway, where am I? Nikolaev complained that in carrying out their work, the Troika had had to rely exclusively on information provided by the special section of the Vicheka. Quote, neither commissars nor local communists provided any material, end quote. The statistical communique of the special section of the extraordinary Troika of the 1st of May was the following data. 6,528 were arrested, of whom 2,168 had been shot, 1,955 been sentenced to forced labor, parenthesis, of whom 1,486 received a 5-year sentence, in parenthesis, and 1,272 released. In a statistical review of the mutiny made in 1935 to 36, the figure of those arrested is given as 10,026, but the review also says, quote, it has not been possible to establish accurately the number of the repressed, end quote. Footnote. Statistical survey as at the 1st of May 1921 of liquidation of Kronstadt mutiny. End footnote. As for measures taken against Kronstadt's civilian population, the Kronstadt Fortress Command, in a secret report of the 21st of April, states that, quote, after the liquidation of the mutiny, approximately 9,000 people, mainly women and children, bracket, largely the families of mutineers, end bracket, were left in Kronstadt, end quote. And it adds, quote, such masses of useless and even harmful people should, like so much ballast, be speedily removed from the fortress, ... and for the following reasons. A. These 9,000 people increase the number of eaters in the fortress by 16%. B. Though they are not occupied in productive and useful work for the fortress, they occupy more than 3,000 rooms and complicate an already severe accommodation crisis. C. This type of population, ... has a high rate of sickness and therefore, from the sanitary point of view, constitutes a serious danger. D. It is almost impossible to control these people politically or militarily, so that military spies from foreign countries and counter-revolutionary organizations could easily shelter among them. End quote. And that's from a secret report of the 21st of April, 1921. The report urges the, quote, speedy deportation to such places as the Kuban, the Ukraine, the Volga areas, where the deported will more easily find occupation and rations, end quote. Footnote, deportations of civilians from Kronstadt Fortress, reported the 21st of April. End footnote. When, by the 30th of May 1921, 600 families had been readied for deportation, Sladkov, in a, quote, top secret, end quote, note, pointed at Siberia as, quote, undoubtedly the only suitable region, end quote, for these people. Footnote, Sladkov on the deportation of 600 families to Siberia, 30th of May 1921. At the end of 1921, some 1,500 families of mutineers were still left in Kronstadt, and in 1922, 2,480 mutineers and their families were deported. Footnote, V.A. Antonov of Sinko's report on deportations from Kronstadt Fortress during 1921 to Politburo, 30th of December, 1921, and report of deportations from Kronstadt Fortress during 1922, 10th of April, 1923. And footnote, with filtration in full swing in the punishment of the mutineers, it is not at all surprising to find that soon after the suppression of Kronstadt, Sladkov was promoted to commissar with the commander of the naval forces, of all the naval forces of the Republic, as well as becoming chairman of the Central Filtration Commission and hence in charge of the filtration process of the entire Soviet Navy. Sladkov's strong views on the Baltic Fleet are already known to us from his 8th of March report to Sklyansky. He expressed them even more forcefully and at length in his, quote, top secret report to the RVSR, parenthesis, that is, to Trotsky, end parenthesis, on the 19th of May, 1921. Sladkov's starting point was the Kronstadt uprising, which had drawn special attention to the need for, quote, filtration and selection, in the Navy, end quote. The fleet, Sladkov insisted, quote, have ceased to be the advance guard of the Republic, but have completely and entirely in parts, bracket, sick, exclamation point, end bracket, turned into counter-revolutionaries, end quote. The reason, Sladkov suggests is that since 1917 and until 1921, important sections of the intelligentsia, bracket, Krupnaya intelligentsia, end bracket, had penetrated into the Navy, quote, youth, students, officer cadets, midshipmen, and others, and such older ones, a large part of them belonging to the aristocracy and the monarchists. This Navy must get rid of the alien abscesses of the counter-revolutionary element, end quote. To achieve this, every fleet must be purged by way of, quote, special political naval local commissions, end quote. These commissions should prepare all preliminary materials for the Central Naval Filtration Commission, parenthesis, that is, for Sladkov, end parenthesis. The Central Commission would then, in the first place, on the basis of the information received, select those suitable for seagoing squadrons, working-class sailors who require instruction, will be sent to appropriate naval classes. Sailors unsuitable for the Navy will be transferred to the Red Army or the Merchant Navy. Finally, elements of a suspect character will be handed over to special sections of filtration. Training classes should be brought up to strength and drawn exclusively from the, quote, healthy working class element, end quote. In the same spirit, naval recruits should in future be drawn exclusively from, quote, the industrial working element as the most politically conscious class, end quote. Sladkov's report to RVSR, 12th of May.
It is not surprising that on the 4th anniversary of the October Revolution, Sladkov lobbied with Trotsky for the release from concentration camps, quote, in faraway Siberia, end quote, end parenthesis, of those sailors who were from, quote, worker peasant elements, I am convinced that were they to be allowed to return to their fields, factories, and plants, they would atone for their guilt against the Soviet state power and contribute to the economic rebirth of the Republic, end quote. Footnote, Sladkov's report to Trotsky, 7th of November, what year is that? 1925? What's the 4th anniversary of Trotsky? John said 22nd, 23rd, 24th, 25th, 26th? Is that the 26th? No. 25th. I don't know. I think that is from Sladkov's report to Trotsky from 7th of November. I'm guessing 1924. I'm not sure. Or 1925. I'm not sure. My math is bad. 1925 would be my guess. Trotsky was told that the Cheka had already set up a filtration commission which would speedily review the possible release of Kronstadt mutineers. Side by side with the punishment of the mutineers, the communist leadership was busy as early as the 16th of March, eliminating all traces of the 16 days interlude when Kronstadt was governed by the Revolutionary Committee. A decree addressed to the forces of the Southern Command ordered, quote, all military commanders and political commissars, Politruks, end bracket, occupying Kronstadt immediately to confiscate all publications of the Kronstadt Revolutionary Committee, and to send all confiscated literature to the political sections, end quote. Footnote, order to troops of Southern groups, 16th of March. Pavel Dybenko, a well-known hardline Bolshevik, was appointed military commandant of Kronstadt with a special troika of tough Kronstadt Bolsheviks, Lazar, Bregman, Gribov, and Vasiliev, to assist Pavel Dybenko. Wikipedia says Pavel Dybenko lived from 1889 to 1938. Pavel Dybenko was a Bolshevik revolutionary and leading Soviet officer and military commander. Pavel Dybenko was arrested, tortured, and executed during the Great Purge and subsequently rehabilitated during the Khrushchev thaw. Back to the text. The Izvestia was renamed Krasny Kronstadt. The Petropavlovsk became the Murat. Kronstadt's time-honored Anchor Square was now to be known as Revolution Square. And in a saddening celebration of the 50th anniversary of the Paris Commune, the name of the Sevastopol was changed to the Paris Commune. Footnote, Decrees of Red Power in Kronstadt, published in Krasny Kronstadt No. 1, 18th of March and 6th of May, published in Paul Averich's Kronstadt, 1921. Or maybe they weren't published, that's just a separate source, Average Kronstadt, 1921. I thought that the sailors themselves named their ship the Murat. I guess that's something I made up. Propaganda was stepped up. Nadezhda Ulyanova, Krupskaya, in parentheses, led the procession of Bolshevik leaders who volunteered or were mobilized to teach the, quote, lessons of Kronstadt, end quote, which Lenin had spelled out on the 8th and 9th of March, 1921, at the 10th Party Congress in sanguine anticipation that, quote, the rising will undoubtedly be liquidated within a few days, if not within a few hours, end quote. Lenin. On the 22nd of March, Krupskaya is chairman of the Glavny Politiko-Prosvetsitelny Komitet Narkomprosa proposed to the Central Committee of the party the publication of a large edition of a, quote, red book on Kronstadt, end quote, which was to spread among the non-party masses the lessons of the Kronstadt events. The, quote, red book on Kronstadt was to be, quote, absolutely popular and suitable for collective reading, parenthesis, of the type of an oral newspaper, end parenthesis, end quote. With its documents and factual materials selected by a commission consisting of representatives of the Cheka, the Narkomindel, and the Central Committee of the party, and its own Glavpolit Prosvet, and composed by a group of writers, its task was, quote, to elucidate events, the internal groupings, the foreign links, the internal developments that marked the internal collapse, end quote. Footnote. Letter of Nadezhda Ulyanova, parenthesis, Krupskaya, end parenthesis, to the Central Committee of the Russian Communist Party on a red book on Kronstadt, 22nd of March, 1921. End footnote. Apparently nothing came of this high-powered project. Krupskaya was followed 2 days later by Trotsky with an ambitious plan for a, quote, political, bracket, show, and bracket, trial of Kronstadters and Makhnovites, end quote, which Trotsky sent to Vyacheslav Molotov, secretary of the Central Committee, with copies to Lenin and Dzerzhinsky. Trotsky wrote, quote, the struggle against the Esarovshchina and anarchism, parenthesis, Kronstadt and Makhno, end parenthesis, being presently an important task, it seems to me appropriate to organize trials of Kronstadters on the one hand and of Makhnovites on the other. With the help of the relevant materials, one could give extra significance to the trial. In any case, the effect of the reports and speeches of the prosecutor, etc., etc., the effects of the reports and the speeches of the prosecutor, etc., will be far more powerful than the effect of brochures and leaflets about the Esarovshchina, Kronstadt, and anarchism. Should you agree, one could hand over the matter to a troika consisting, for example, of comrades Dzerzhinsky, Bukharin, and Karl Radek, parenthesis, or Kursky, end parenthesis. It would be desirable to deal with this question tomorrow, on the 25th of March, in the Politburo of the Central Committee, inviting Comrade Dzerzhinsky to be present, end quote. Trotsky to Molotov, secretary of the RKP, absolutely secret, 24th of March, 1921. Trotsky's, quote, political trial, end quote, was apparently never staged, one possible reason being that the three candidates for the major roles in the tragic farce, Kozlovsky, Petrochenko, and Sergei Putilin, a defrocked priest, had escaped to the safety of neighboring Finland. But that the trial had been seriously considered can be gauged from the summaries of the testimonies, bracket, conspecti, end bracket, for all three men that had already been prepared in advance. They are interesting in that they provide some insight into the, quote, agitational, end quote, points which the trial was intended to make. The summary, bracket, conspect, end bracket, intended for Kozlovsky, presents Kozlovsky as a Tsarist general who had been decorated by the Tsarist government. Kozlovsky's major motive for acting against Soviet state power was, quote, its responsibility for the terrible situation, end quote, and his, quote, burning desire to rescue Russia and restore Russia's might and old traditions, one and indivisible. Kozlovsky was therefore deeply opposed to the, quote, conclusion of peace with Poland on unfavorable terms, end quote. Convinced of the necessity of, quote, overthrowing state power by armed force, I have been seeking connections with émigré circles in Western Europe, such as England, France, and Romania, even before the Kronstadt mutiny, end quote. Together with Baron von Wilken and representatives of the Entente, Kolakowski took part in the mutiny's preparatory work, in the course of which Kozlovsky, Jesus Christ, I keep saying his name wrong, Kozlovsky, took part in the mutiny's preparatory work, in the course of which Kozlovsky found it necessary to use the SRs, the Mensheviks, and the anarchists, as well as the slogan of, quote, a just Soviet state power, end quote. And this Kozlovsky did in the hope that on receipt of foreign assistance, Kozlovsky would be able to rid himself of that, quote, superfluous ballast, end quote. Stepan Petrochenko, was presented in the draft summary as an anarchist and Makhnovite. After the defeat of the Makhnovite organization in open battle against Soviet state power in the Ukraine, Stepan Petrochenko had been sent together with other activists into underground organizations in the north to take advantage of the food and fuel difficulties there. Kronstadt had been chosen because of Kronstadt's geographic position, and also because Kronstadt's sailors were believed to be particularly susceptible to Makhnovite ideas. Stepan Petrochenko had joined the Revolutionary Committee to work actively for these ideas, and also because Petrochenko had been elected by a general meeting of the Petropavlovsk sailors. Father Sergei Putilin became an SR after the revolution and worked as a teacher and in the school section of the Politprosvet of Orsk during the Soviet period. Sergei Putilin had distinguished himself by, quote, his hypocrisy and by fawning on the bosses, end quote. Sergei Putilin explains his participation in the mutiny by pointing to his conviction that Soviet power and the workers' dictatorship was disastrous for Russia. Likewise, Sergei Putilin was convinced of the dire need for a constituent assembly to make the will of the people manifest. The Bolsheviks, Sergei Putilin believed, had seized power to enslave the people. When asked by the prosecutor whether it did not seem dangerous to him that white Guardist officers had become the ringleaders, he replied that, quote, in the transition period from the Soviets to the Uchredilka, a dictatorship is needed to put down anarchy and Bolshevism, end quote. The slogan of Free Soviets, Putilin explains incoherently, quote, means Soviets of freedom elected without Bolsheviks, end quote. Sergei Putilin supports, quote, full freedom of trade, end quote. Sergei Putilin speaks pompously and sincerely on, quote, the historical role of the SR Party in the rescue of the great people that carries God in their hearts, but that has been corrupted and ruined by the Bolsheviks, end quote. Sergei Putilin reports the arrival of Chernov's emissary and the projected visit of Chernov himself. Similarly, another ambitious Politburo project, the creation of a commission for the study of the Kronstadt events, whose establishment had been decided on at a meeting of the Politburo on the 6th of April, was canceled as early as the 12th of April. Indeed, even the rather modest assignment given by the Politburo to Zinoviev, Radek, and Václav Vorovsky, quote, to write brochures on the Kronstadt events, end quote, produced only one, by Radek, and only after the Central Committee of the Communist Party resolved, on the 16th of May, quote, to order Comrade Radek to complete the brochure on the Kronstadt events and the role in it of the Mensheviks and SRs within 1 week, end quote. Footnote. Sessions of Politburo regarding Commission to study Kronstadt events, 6th and 12th of April. Also session of Central Committee, RKP, Russian Communist Party, which resolves to order Radek to complete brochure within 1 week, 16th of May. Footnote. Wikipedia says Václav Vorovsky lived from 1871 to 1923. Václav Vorovsky was a Russian Bolshevik revolutionary, literary critic, journalist, and Soviet diplomat. One of the first Soviet diplomats, Václav Vorovsky is best remembered as the victim of a May 1923 political assassination in Switzerland, where Václav Vorovsky was the official representative of the Soviet government to the Conference of Lausanne. Back to the text. While the intensified propaganda campaign to discredit the Kronstadt protest movement and to justify the Kronstadt protest movement's brutal suppression got off to a bad start, the Bolsheviks, masters of staging revolutionary military ceremonies and parades, rounded off their victory over prostrate Kronstadt with two impressive commemorative celebrations. On the 25th of March in Petersburg, a, quote, sad celebration, in honor of the victims of the Kronstadt mutiny, end quote, took the subdued form of an assembly of mourning in Uritsky Square, in which a Kursanti choir performed Cherubini's Requiem, the anthem, quote, do not cry over corpses, end quote, and the time-hallowed revolutionary funeral song, You Fell a Sacrifice in the Fatal Fight. The speeches were made by minor party figures such as Kuzmin and Lashevich, strangely enough not even by Zinoviev. The ceremony ended with a funeral procession led by a troop of cavalry Kursanti, a detachment of Kursanti infantry, and naval infantry and artillery units which marched from Uritsky Square to the 25th of October Prospect. Footnote. Morning assembly in Petrograd, 25th of March, in honor of, quote, victims of Kronstadt mutiny. End footnote. By contrast, the victory parade, quote, in honor of the heroes of Kronstadt, end quote, which took place in Moscow's Red Square on the 3rd of April, was grandiose and triumphant. Footnote. Parade, quote, in honor of the heroes of Kronstadt, end quote, in Moscow, 3rd of April, 1921. End footnote. Moscow's military colleges, garrisons, and communist units, led by a Kronstadt contingent, filed past Trotsky, who in the name of the worker-peasant Red Army of the Republic saluted, quote, the victors of Kronstadt, end quote. Trotsky was followed by, quote, Comrade Tukhachevsky, leader of the Kronstadt victories, end quote, who saluted the, quote, Kursanti heroes, end quote, and the Red Army units. Trotsky then presented a military banner to the, quote, Battalion of Red Kursanti, which had immortalized its name, end quote, and sang the praise of, quote, the unprecedented heroism, the unheard-of feat of arms of our Kursanti and the Red Army units whom they inspired when they stormed and captured a first-class naval fortress, end quote. Trotsky's speech in Red Square was remarkable not only for its glorification of the Kursanti, who had proved themselves as something like a Praetorian Guard in the Kronstadt events, but also for it containing a cynical, lying, and ideal-type Bolshevik version of the Kronstadt tragedy. Quote, Kronstadt was but one link in the steel chain which the imperialists of all countries were forging against Soviet power, and under the slogan of merely, quote, correcting Soviet power, and under the slogan of merely, end bracket, quote, correcting Soviet power, end quote, of a, quote, Soviet power without communists, end quote, the domestic and international bourgeoisie tried to turn workers and peasants against Soviet power. They tried to kill Soviet power with the slogan of, quote, non-party Soviets. Some of the sailors took the bait, and we waited as long as possible in the hope that these blinded comrade sailors, bracket, sick, exclamation point, end bracket, would, with their own eyes, see where their mutiny was leading them. So we found ourselves facing the danger of the thawing of the ice and were forced to deliver a short and honest blow, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's speech at the Victory Parade in Moscow's Red Square, 3rd of April, 1921. In the penultimate issue of the Izvestia, the Revolutionary Committee, published on the eve of the fall of Kronstadt, Evenkits, a sailor from the Sevastopol, bitterly denounced the campaign of willful lies and deception that the Bolshevik leaders had been waging against Kronstadt. Quote, when we, through our authority, propose that you send a delegation to Kronstadt and satisfy yourselves impartially that we have no generals nor epaulets. I don't know what the hell that means. Epaulets? What the hell does that mean? An ornamental shoulder piece on an item of clothing, especially on the coat or jacket of a military uniform. Oh, it's like the stripes thing on the read a military journal, military uniform. So let me restart that. This is event kits. Quote, when we, through our authority, propose that you send a delegation to Kronstadt and satisfy yourselves impartially that we have no generals or epaulets, but that here is a mass of working people that have taken power into their own hands, your power opened fire. Why did they do that? The leaders of your power could not have been ignorant of the truth, and therefore, since they knew the truth, they were committing a crime. End quote. Evenkits. Did I say Evenkits earlier? Evenkins is the name. Footnote. Izvestia of Provisional Revolutionary Committee, number 14, 16th of March, 1921. End footnote. And that's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.